Welcome to Podcast and Business from Boston, Massachusetts. Today, my guest is Whitney Johnson. Whitney is an executive coach, speaker, and innovation thinker. She was named one of the most influential management thinkers by Thinkers 50, and she's also a contributor to the Harvard Business Review. She's the author of the book Disrupt Yourself. Whitney shared with us why this process and the S-curve in our disruption are so important. Hi, Whitney. How are you?
Hello, Juan Carlos.
Thank you for being my guest today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. I will start, Whitney, with a simple question. How would you define the concept disrupt yourself?
All right. Well, we've got to do definitions. So let's start with the definition of disruption. So a disruptive innovation is a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And I know you've had some of his colleagues on your podcast, like Karen Dillon, in the past.
Yes.
But at its simplest, it's a silly little thing that takes over the world, like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. More recently, Netflix disrupt Blockbuster, now cable TV, and Uber disrupt cabs. And so that's what a disruptive innovation looks like. Personal disruption, though, and this idea of disrupt yourself, personal disruption is how you take all these ideas and make them meaningful to you. So you start at the bottom of a ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder, like the children's game Chutes and Ladders. Now,
I know.
The big difference with personal disruption is that with personal disruption, your Netflix and your Blockbuster, your Uber and your cabs, you're the silly little thing, and you take over the world because you are disrupting you. So when you disrupt yourself, you're basically stepping back from who you are to slingshot into who you can be. You're disrupting who am I today in order to be a better version of myself tomorrow. And that's what personal disruption is.
Well, yeah, thank you for helping me with this definition. I said disrupt ourselves or oneself is about take important decisions as well, being bold, being brave. Which is very important because sometimes it's move from our comfort zone is difficult. And speaking about decisions, my dear Whitney, in your book, Disrupt Yourself, I have in my hand here, you talk about a turning point in your career when you were working at Merrill Lynch.
Yeah.
In 2005. Was this an example of disrupting yourself because you want to leave Merrill Lynch, the comfort zone? It's a great company. I have my stocks there. So, and tell me, it was a really example of disrupting yourself?
Absolutely. And so let me tell you that story of how I disrupted myself, but then we can talk maybe a little bit more about how to think about this more broadly. So I was working at Merrill Lynch. It was 2005, and I had now read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. So I read it in 2002, 2003 timeframe. And when I first read it, I was like, wow, this idea of disruption, this is so fascinating. This is helping me understand what's going on in Latin America, because at the time I was a stock analyst and I was covering emerging markets, telecom, and media. For example, I was covering América Móvil. And I was wondering, why is América Móvil every quarter beating my estimates? Telmex is not beating my estimates, which is the fixed line, and América Móvil was the wireless. And when I read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton and understood this concept of disruption, I realized, oh, this is what's happening. Wireless is disrupting wireline. So I'd now read this book. I now had this framework in my idea that this silly little thing can take over the world. And so at one point, I can remember I had gone to my boss and I'd said, hey, I've been working as an equity analyst for about 8 years. I'd really like to do something new. And his comment came back to me was really, actually, we want you to stay right where you are. And so I've read the book. I've read about disruption. And it was at that point I had this aha that disruption wasn't just about products. It wasn't just about companies. It was also about people. And that if I was going to accomplish what I felt like I wanted or needed to accomplish it in life, which at this point I didn't really know what it was. We had this feeling, right? We had this feeling of something we need to do. I was going to have to disrupt myself. Now, to a lot of people, that felt and seemed and looked very illogical because, as you said, Merrill Lynch is a really good company. I had a really good job. And so one of the things that happens when we disrupt ourselves is that it will look to a lot of people like we've lost our mind, and we're because we're making that decision to become a silly little thing. But basically what's happening when you decide to disrupt yourself is that maybe like this functional job is getting done. You're making money, you're putting food on the table, but there's an emotional job that's not getting done. And for me, that emotional job wasn't getting done. And that's usually the motivation behind a person making that decision to disrupt themselves and do something new. So that was the big event that led me to leave Merrill.
Mhm.
But I will say, and we can maybe circle back to this, is that personal disruption isn't just about those big, bold career moves. Like I said, it might be that decision that when someone says something that offends you, instead of doing what you've always done when they've offended you, you make the decision to step back from who
Exactly.
you were and be the bigger person and seek to understand rather than just try to tell them why they are wrong.
Exactly. And it's very important in your book. You mentioned that disrupt yourself before disrupting others. Interesting point, Whitney. In many of your podcasts, when you share about disrupt yourself, etc., you talk always about the positive impact of disrupting ourselves or oneself. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of alluded to this a minute ago, but if you think about what is personal disruption, if you can imagine for everybody who's listening, sort of this vertical line that's our y-axis, then you've got this horizontal line, y-axis of success, and this horizontal axis of time. And so what's happening is that let's say you're on the y-axis at a 12 of success, and your life is moving along. You're sort of over one, up one, over one, up one, like a staircase. But when you disrupt yourself, what you're doing, if you're thinking about this from a math perspective, is you're making a decision to move down on that axis from 12 to an 8 because you believe in the future that instead of it being over one, up one, that staircase will get very steep and it'll be over one, up 3 or over one, up 5. And so one of the reasons that you disrupt yourself for you personally is that you believe that if you will step back, you're going to slingshot forward. You're going to move up that staircase faster, whether that's stepping back in your career, taking a job that is a lateral move that doesn't quite make sense to people, or quitting your job in my case. But you believe that if you do that in the future, you will
Exactly.
be in a better place. Step back can look like when you make a capital expenditure in your business, you buy a piece of equipment. Well, you're parting with hard-earned cash, but you're doing that because you believe that buying that piece of equipment, there will be a return on that investment. The step back can be something as simple as making the decision that every Sunday, like I do, you're going to unplug. You're going to have a day of rest. And the reason you do that, it seems counterintuitive. Well, if I
Mhm.
take a day off from work, then I'm going to lose that day. And yet you step back to slingshot forward because the research tells us is that when you take a break, you're actually going to be more productive because your brain and your body and your heart will be rested. And so that's the positive impact for you personally. But then what happens from there? When I disrupt myself because of the contagion effect and I start making changes, people
Exactly.
around me, there's that kinetic energy, they start changing too.
Yeah.
And so when you change and I change and another person on our team changes, then now you've got a whole pod of people changing. That becomes a catalyst for an organization to change. And so my thesis is the fundamental unit of disruption, of change in an organization is the individual. And when individuals grow, when individuals disrupt themselves, you're going to accelerate the growth of your organization.
Yeah, and also in your book, oh no, in your episode, in one episode of your podcast, you mentioned that the disruption ourselves or yourself in this case, have a good effect in our dopamine. So,
Yes.
which means it's a huge impact, and you say, it's replicate all the good feeling that you said. And speaking about your podcast, there is an episode that one of your guests, John Rath, who have a very rare genetic disorder with only 16 years old. And the
Mm-hmm.
doctor told him, you know what, you
Yep.
have only probably live until 40 years old. And he rethink his life in early years. In 16, can you believe a kid in 16 years old, because he have tumors everywhere to catapult himself, and now he's a famous author and sold like 5 million copies of his book. Amazing.
So just for everybody listening, so that Podhouse episode is Tom Rath, and he wrote the book Strength Finders 2.0. So he's
Unbelievable.
part of the Strength Finders clan, and it's the best-selling book on Amazon of all time. But I think what you're saying is from a disruption standpoint, he had a disease disrupt him, but instead of allowing it to trammel him, he said, well, how am I going to disrupt myself? And he said, I got a deadline. I've got a constraint. What am I going to do in that time that I have?
Whitney, let's talk about the S curve. In fact, I have here your article that you wrote with Juan Carlos Mendez Garcia. I have my same name
Yeah,
from Colombia.
it's a good name.
Yeah, the article is Throw Your Life a Curve. And you mention all the time in your episode, which is great, about the S curve.
Right.
To me, it's a process. And you mentioned before about the stepping back. I think some people want the thing fast, but sometimes it's take a time because the progress, sometimes the initial progress, sometimes it's slow, as you mentioned in your article. Why this process so important in our life or career?
Yeah. So, all right. So let's put these pieces together. So, like I said, one of the first big ahas that I had was that disruption's not just about products; it's about people. That like we can disrupt ourselves. Well, the second big aha that I had in the investing that I was doing, this came in the investing that I was doing with Clayton, was that we started using the S curve, which was popularized by E.M. Rogers in 1962, to help us figure out how quickly will an innovation how quickly will it be adopted. And so, whenever you've got a new innovation, you've got it at the base of the S, and initially growth is very slow. It actually isn't slow; it just appears to be slow because you don't have a lot of critical mass. But then, if it starts to gain traction, it's going to move into the knee of the curve and that steep, sleek back of that S curve, where the growth not only feels fast, or not only looks fast, or not only is fast, but it looks fast. So that's the fast part of the curve. And then you get to the high end of the curve where the market is now saturated. Sort of, you've reached carrying capacity, and so growth tapers off. Well, the big aha that I had here was that we could also use this S curve to help us understand how we learn and how we grow. And so I call it the S curve of learning. Such an original name, right? So basically, every time you start something new, you start a new project, you start a new job, you start a new podcast, although yours is not new, you're at the base of the S, and growth is going to feel slow, and you're going to have days where you're like, it seemed like a really good idea, but I don't feel like I'm making progress. And so you might feel overwhelmed, you might feel discouraged, but when you understand this, you have this mental model of it's supposed to feel slow, then that helps you gain a sense of, okay, I can do this. This is how it's supposed to feel right now. But then you put in that effort in whatever it is that you're doing new, and you accelerate into that sweet spot, that steep part of the curve. Whereas unlike at the launch point where it took a lot of time to feel like anything was happening, now in a little time, a lot happens. So it's hard, but not too hard. It's easy, but not too easy. You feel like you're right where you're supposed to be. It is exhilarating, and you are going fast. And that's the sweet spot. And then at the high end, what happens is you're like,
mastery.
Yeah, you're in mastery. You're like, okay, well, I figured this out. I'm really good at this. But as you mentioned earlier, Juan Carlos, is because you figured it out and you're really good at it, you're not getting any more dopamine. You're not getting those feel-good effects that come with learning. And so you can start to stagnate. So you were overwhelmed. Now you're underwhelmed. And so what happens once you get to that top of that S curve, you've learned, now it's time to leap and repeat. In other words, once you get to the top, you disrupt yourself. Obviously, you're disrupting yourself all the way along, but up at the top, there's a bigger disruption that takes place. And so the S curve is important because it is a very quick and simple visual for you and I to think about what growth looks like. And when we understand what growth looks like, then we can grow faster because we can identify where we are on the curve and then build momentum regardless of where we are on that curve.
Exactly. We have to know what part in the curve we are. For example, in my opinion, some people probably will feel, oh, I am getting slow and I want to giving up. No, it's a process. I am living right now my own S curve because I love climate change, all the topics. And now I feel that I can share all the information about climate change, sustainability. But in the beginning, it was because I'm no science, so I respect all the science, by the way. So I had to learn, prepare myself, and now I can write something. I am feeling a little bit more comfortable. I am feeling the feel good effect right now in my curve, which is great. Yeah,
I love that. Like you said, at the launch point, there was a lack of confidence, and now you're like, okay, I'm in the groove. I feel like I know what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
You find it engaging, and now you're talking about it. Sweet spot of the S curve.
Whitney, we are just almost finishing this conversation. Is there anything you would like to add to our audience, here in US and around the world?
Yeah. Tú quieres que hable español, ¿no?
No, up to you. You can speak in Spanish or in English.
No,
People will understand. They will understand
no,
you anyways.
disrúmpate. So what I would say is that whenever if it feels scary and lonely, you're on the right
Mhm.
path. I mean, that's what happens when you disrupt yourself. You're playing where no one else is playing. And so just when you're doing something, you're like, I feel a little bit scared and I feel a little bit lonely. Um, Ask yourself, the question is this because this is the wrong place, the wrong curve for you to be on, or is in fact this is exactly where you're supposed to be? And that feeling of being a little bit scared.
Or wrong people
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes,
as well.
right. Wrong place or wrong people. Well said. But oftentimes that feeling of fear is basically telling you you're in exactly the right place with exactly the right people, but you're at the launch point of the curve. And so it's just time for you to persist a little bit longer.
Good point. Whitney, where can people reach you?
Well, I
Where people
have.
can learn more about disrupt ourselves or yourself?
Yeah. So absolutely. So you can obviously read Disrupt Yourself, but we have a little goodie for people that are listening today. For anybody who's like looking at 2020 and saying, this was a really tough year, I'm not sure what to make of it. Well, I argue that a year of disruption, a year of upheaval is the place and time where we grow the most. And so we put together a mini download for you where you can look at disruption look at 2020 through the lens of disruption and think about how you're going to leverage that going into 2021. And so if people are interested, you can go to whitneyjohnson.com
Mhm.
/JC Giraldo.
Thank you so much. Okay. Every Tuesday you share in LinkedIn your life that were great, by the way.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. So every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I do a LinkedIn Live at 9 a.m. Eastern
Mhm.
in the United States. It's a lot of fun. We do it for a half an hour and we talk. I share content. I share a lesson every week, but then we have conversations with everybody that's on the live. And you've joined us a few times, right?
I did, yeah, all
Yeah.
the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's a lot
so
of fun.
insightful and fun, which is
Yeah.
important.
Thank you. Thank you.
Whitney, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. Gracias por invitarme.
Oh, gracias a ti. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you so much, everyone.